College for having me here and to the audience for coming to this occasion. What I want to do is, in the aftermath of Charlie Hebdo, which was almost exactly 4 weeks ago today, but we may add to that last Saturday in Denmark, the attempted murder of Lars Vilks, Swedish cartoonist, who did the famous Mohammed as a roundabout dog cartoon in 2008. So these things are happening more. What I want to concentrate on, and I don't want to take up most of the time in a presentation, but to set these things in a larger context, a global context, because most people in the West tend to notice these things only when they happen in the West. So if we're asked to look at sort of famous cases of where there's an eruption around blasphemy or apostasy or insulting Islam, things which may come to your mind correctly would be the murder of Theo van Gogh in the street in Amsterdam after he produced a documentary on the status of women in Muslim lands. You might remember he was killed, attempted beheading on the street in Amsterdam. That was over 10 years ago. Or if we would go back further, of course, the one which inaugurated the modern age of attempting to kill those accused of blasphemy is the fatwa by the Ayatollah Khomeini against the British Indian author Salman Rushdie, which fatwa, by the way, the Iranians said it no longer stands. Of course it stands. The only person who can remove it is the person who issues it. He's dead. So Rushdie is still under that threat. Other things, what we usually call the Danish cartoons, published by Yale and Poston in 2005, the Swedish cartoons I mentioned, with the affairs around the killing of the American ambassador in Libya, in Tripoli, more than last year. The film trailer, The Innocence of Muslims, which had been seen by about 3 people on the internet till that event took place. Pastor Terry Jones's threat to burn the Quran created a lot of fuss worldwide. His actual burning of a Quran 2 years later caused almost no stir. And the attack on Charlie Hebdo and the attack on Lars Vilks, or the response to Pope Benedict's Regensburg speech. So these things are going on regularly. They're increasing in number. And these are the ones which we're usually aware of. They happen closer to us. But one of the first points I want to make is these particular instances are markedly atypical of accusations of blasphemy or insulting Islam worldwide. In the book which Professor Gladder mentioned, Silenced, we survey accusations, sometimes by the government, but more often by private parties, accusations of insulting Islam or blasphemy in some 26 Muslim-majority countries and in about 14 Western countries. We cover thousands of cases involving millions of people. And so this is a worldwide global phenomenon, and the things of which we are aware are simply the tip of a very large iceberg. But if we look at trends worldwide, we firstly notice the number of such accusations and attacks are increasing. They've been increasing exponentially in the last 25 years. Also, we have a PowerPoint here. Excuse me. So it's a growing trend. You all heard that already. The events that get the attention, and we survey, and I mean millions of people. There are fatwas condemning people, the people of the Nuba Mountains, 600,000 of them, were condemned as apostates who should be killed by the Sudanese government, did this in 1993. But if we survey the trends of these types of accusations, firstly, the charges are usually vague. And this is even when there's a law on the books. In most cases, there isn't. A very partial list of accusations for which people have been physically attacked or killed or arrested are, here's some, we'll list about 65. Apostasy. As you know, ISIS in the Middle East, one of the things it does with anybody who disagrees with it, Muslims or whatever else, says, well, if you disagree with us, you're not a true Muslim, therefore you've left Islam, therefore you're an apostate, therefore we can kill you. And they kill you. So apostasy is used very vaguely. And insulting a heavenly religion, that's section 98F of the Egyptian Penal Code. Creating confusion amongst Muslims, that's an offense in Malaysia, it's an offense in Iran and a few other places. Imitating Christians, that will get you imprisoned in Iran. Harboring destructive thoughts, friendship with the enemies of God, or we have fighting against God. My view is if someone wants to fight against God, if I were a gambling man, I would take great odds on the winner, so why would you stop him? But anyway, fighting against God, dissension from religious dogma, and propagation of spiritual liberalism. The last two are offenses drawn from the Sharia code in Iran. And there are many others. But I just give this list very rapidly to give you a sense of the breadth of the things that we are talking about. Henceforth, in this lecture, I'm just going to use the term blasphemy as a shorthand for this entire list. So that's the first one. The accusations are usually extremely vague, even if there's a legal code, and very often there isn't. Secondly, the first is they're vague. Secondly, such accusations are often shaped by political manipulation. Just to give one example, as mentioned, and you probably remember, or maybe you don't, in 2005, the Danish newspaper, Jylland-Posten, which actually is the largest newspaper in Denmark, published a dozen cartoons. They're usually called cartoons of Muhammad. Most of them are not depictions of Muhammad. The background to this was that a children's book writer was commissioned to write a book on the life of Muhammad for children. This was meant to be a very respectful thing, had a life of Jesus, life of Buddha, and so on, and wanted illustrations for it, just drawing illustrations. In the entirety of Denmark, he could not find a cartoonist. She could not find a cartoonist to do that. And raised this thing with Flemming Rose, who was the cultural editor of Jylland-Posten, and he thought, we've got a problem here. We can't illustrate a children's book. And Rose also added he was used to be based in Moscow. He's a foreign correspondent in the former Soviet Union. He said, I started to notice a phenomenon which we always knew about in Moscow. That is, if you start talking about a certain subject, people look around. Who might be here? Who's listening? And he says, that's what we're doing in Denmark right now. So hence those cartoons. So the cartoons came out in September 2005. And what happened? Anybody want to? That's not a rhetorical question. They came out September 2005. What happened in the weeks following? The answer is pretty well nothing. Danish Muslims, a variety of Danish Muslims, peacefully demonstrated outside the office of Jylland-Posten, said they shouldn't do that and they should apologize. This was a perfectly democratic response to perceived insult. But people now remember correctly killings of dozens of people in Nigeria, killings in Pakistan, killing in Afghanistan. But those took place in February 2006, 5 months afterwards. When the cartoons came out, there was no spontaneous upwelling of rage. What happened in the intervening 5 months is 3 radical imams from Denmark got these cartoons and added a few of their own, which were really nasty. The Jylland-Posten ones are pretty tame. And went around the Middle East showing them and saying, this is what they're saying about this. And then the organization of the Islamic Conference, an organization of some 56 countries and territories, at their meeting in Mecca, changed the agenda from dealing with terrorism to deal with what they called Islamophobia and insults to Islam. So out of that meeting in Mecca, hosted by the Saudis, came a plan of action, which involved demonstrations throughout the world, protests, boycotts of Danish and other products. So basically, 5 months after the cartoons came out, a variety of governments decided to make an issue of this and put a lot of time and money into it. That's when the eruption happened. So many of the things we're seeing are not just spontaneous eruptions. Of course, Muslims do get angry about these. But in most cases, if you get widespread demonstrations and death, that's usually because some governmental figures want that to happen and at least stoke it. Just a clarification here, by the way, I'm not saying, you will have often heard the phrase, oh, that's political, not religious. That's not what I'm saying. A thing can be political and religious too. You know, is the Christian Democratic Party, the governing party in Germany, is that political or religious? Well, obviously it's both. That's like saying, you know, is it blue or is it a foot long? Well, it could be both those things. So, but the only, you know, in order for a government to manipulate a sentiment, or for an organization like ISIS to manipulate a sentiment, the sentiment has to be there in the first place. You can't stoke people's religious beliefs unless they've got religious beliefs. So the religious sentiment has to be there in the first place. I'm not saying this is a myth, but I am saying there is political manipulation in order to make these things blow up. So, the third, while accusations from governments can be bad, that you're formally charged under a penal code, say in Pakistan, or under a Sharia code in Iran. The biggest danger, as we've seen from the attacks in the West, is usually not governments, but mobs, vigilantes, and terrorists. To give an example, Pakistan probably has the most stringent blasphemy codes in the world. And in their modern form, they were instituted starting under Zia al-Haq in the 1980s. Thousands of people have been accused. Hundreds of people have been imprisoned. No one has, and 2 out of the 3 major blasphemy codes carry the death penalty. Nobody has ever been, in the modern age, nobody's ever been executed in Pakistan for blasphemy. But there are hundreds of people dead. If you're accused of blasphemy, there's a good chance you will be killed immediately. Probably your best bet is to try and get arrested very quickly and put behind bars. But then you may get killed by the police, or the police will put you in a cell with a dozen other people and say you're a blasphemer and you die. Or in one case, 3 people, in this case 3 Christians, were acquitted of blasphemy accusations from the High Court in Punjab, and as they came out of the court, they were machine gunned to death. So there are ongoing deaths in Pakistan all the time. But it's either extra legal violence by the police or mobs or vigilantes. Governments are bad, but vigilantism is the worst. Fourth major finding is who tends to be the victims. There are 4 major categories of victims. Summarizing them quickly, they are, I'll call them post-Islamic beliefs. It's not a good term, but in particular in this context, Baha'is and Ahmadis. That is, people who either believe or are thought by many Muslims to believe that there has been a prophet after Muhammad, and therefore they're violating the tenets of Islam. A second grouping, I'll go into these in more detail, is what I call actual apostates, someone who says, yeah, I was a Muslim, I'm not anymore. They may have converted to another religion, usually it's Christianity, or they've just become unbelievers. The third general category is Muslims of the wrong type, by which I mean if you're Sunni, Shia, or Sufi, in a situation where you're the minority. That's probably the largest, in numbers, the largest category of victims. And fourthly, Muslim religious and political reformers and dissidents. Comment on the Baha'is. Baha'is began in Iran in the 19th century and are accused of sort of denying the truths of Islam because they have a prophet after Islam. They have a difficult time in many Muslim majority contexts, especially so in Iran. These are the 7 major leaders of the Baha'i community in Iran. They were arrested in 2008, sentenced and imprisoned in 2010, and are due to be held till 2028. Also, because Baha'is are not a recognized religion in Iran, they have no legal status, which means there are no penalties for killing a Baha'i. They are legally non-persons. So if someone murders a Baha'i, there are no legal consequences. So then we have Ahmadis, who I mentioned. I'll go back. They have a tough time in many places, but especially so in Pakistan, where they're subject to very many attacks, and their mosques are bombed. In fact, they cannot use the term, they cannot call their places of worship a mosque. That's illegal. Also, if you're a Pakistani Muslim, in order to get a passport, one of the sections of the forms you fill out requires you to denounce the Ahmadis. If you go to the website of the Embassy of Pakistan in Washington, D.C., you will find that form on the website. So the former ambassador is a good friend of mine. He's a colleague now at Hudson. He always found that immensely embarrassing, but couldn't do much about it. So Baha'is and Ahmadis, and between them we're looking at probably in Iran and Pakistan, 1 million people. Then what I'm calling actual apostates, people who themselves would agree they've changed religion or dropped it. Just a few examples. Fazil Say, a Turkish concert pianist, and an atheist, an outspoken atheist. That's 2013, was given a 10-month sentence for tweets which were held to be denigrating religious values. Or another example, a very famous one, lousy photograph. You remember the case of Miriam Ibrahim in Sudan. She had an American husband. She was back in Sudan, and they discovered that she had been born a Muslim, so she was imprisoned and sentenced to death for apostasy. She gave birth while in prison, and this case dragged on. Subsequently, she was released in July of last year. But there are many instances of people of a Muslim background who converted to another religion and are attacked and may be sentenced to death or killed. The third category of victims is just say Muslims of the wrong type. That is, you're a Muslim, you're a Shia or a Sufi. Sufis could be either Sunnis or Shias. In a repressive place which upholds a different form of Islam. So, for example, in Saudi Arabia, if you are a Shia, you have a rough time. If you're a Sufi, you can have a rough time. Shia, again, have problems in Egypt. Their leaders are imprisoned. There are killings in Pakistan. They're essentially forbidden in Malaysia. There are attacks on Shia also in Indonesia. On the other hand, Sunnis can have a difficult time in a place such as Iran. So again, this usually embraces, this puts penalties on millions of people. Just one example, a photograph. After various Sufis, including dervishes, of whom you may have heard, were protesting the repression and imprisonment of their leaders in Iran over the last several years. And there was a peaceful demonstration by Sufis, which the police and mobs broke up quite viciously. She had her arm broken and several other things. Fourth category of who these victims are is Muslim religious and political reformers and dissidents. I want to say more about this because this is key in how we understand ways of combating radicalism or extremism in an Islamic context. And these current attacks on people accused of blasphemy or insulting Islam have major effects because they lead to the repression of, for want of a better term, Muslim moderates and give a louder voice to more radical voices. Example of what I mean. This man, an Afghan, Ali Mohakek Nasab, he was the editor of a magazine. Actually, the magazine was called Women's Rights, but this was Afghanistan, so there was a man who edited it. But Ali was a very courageous editor. And back in 2005, when it was discovered that a particular Afghan had become a Christian, and the parliament, and supported by the Karzai government, had him imprisoned, and there was an appeal to get him killed. This, by the way, is our ally Afghanistan, when the US Army was there in force. And in this magazine, Ali published 2 articles, and one said, is it really the case that Islam requires us to kill people who we think are apostates or converts? And the second article said, is it really the case that Islam requires us to stone adulterers? For publishing those 2 articles, he was accused of blasphemy and was imprisoned. And this particular case was a wake-up call for me because I was dealing with some of the cases of converts. But the realization that you cannot do anything about restrictions on sort of conversion or apostasy in Islam, or you cannot deal with the question of the status of women in places such as Afghanistan or Pakistan, or a variety of other questions, unless you are allowed to talk about them, unless you can discuss them. And restrictions on sort of criticizing Islam or insulting Islam have the major effect that the other issues cannot be talked about. So the possibility of reform, where reform is needed, is pushed away. And again, the people who are empowered are the more radical voices because they are the ones who throw out accusations of insulting Islam and so on. So the dealing with many other problems in contemporary extremism with Islam becomes impossible when you have these types of blasphemy restrictions because they forbid discussion of the issues. Take one other example, again, of a Muslim, Mohsen Kadivar, an Iranian scholar. He's been in prison for insulting Islam. What did he do? Well, as you probably know in background, that the system of government in Iran is historically very unusual. It's called the Vilayat al-Faqih. It basically means the people we call clerics rule and run the country. That is contrary to traditional Shiite positions. That was largely an innovation brought in by Khomeini. And Kadivar, being a much more traditionalist Shia scholar, wrote a 3-volume work called The Theory of the State in Shiite Jurisprudence. You know, this is not the sort of thing you'd find at the checkout counter at the supermarket. This was a large, dense, thorough legal review of traditional Shia positions on the role of clerics, Islamic jurists, in the state. And he concluded that the present system of government in Iran, I'll quote a translation, has no foundation in Shiite jurisprudence. So that's what he argued. So the government said, well, that's insulting Islam. Why? We're an Islamic government. We represent Islam. So if you criticize us, you're criticizing Islam. So you can't do that. Grand Ayatollah Boroujerdi, who's near death in prison in Iran, for a similar position. So within Iran, apart from the sufferings of other people, Baha'is, Christian converts, Sufis and others in Iran, is people who dissent, particularly in this context, I'll call them theologians, clergy, scholars, who dissent from the government view, are hit with this type of accusation. So change within Iran becomes difficult. What many other examples in the Muslim world, I'll go back to some. These also affect Muslims in the West. 2 examples. Mimane Boussakla, she is a Belgian, she's a senator in the Belgian parliament, who has to travel with bodyguards because she's criticized things about the status of women in some Muslim communities in Belgium. So she is still talking, but she travels with bodyguards. Another one, Akin Delegos, the first Muslim member of the legislature in Germany, member of the Green Party, almost exactly the same situation. And maybe you've asked the question or heard others ask the question, why do so many Muslims stay quiet on these issues? Well, it's because they might get killed. And this is even in the West. Imagine if you happen to live in Pakistan or Iran or Saudi Arabia. So just one more. Shahin Najafi, an Iranian rap singer in Germany, was recently in 2013 declared an apostate who must be killed. Again, many such examples could be killed of Muslims in the West who, if they speak out about these issues, are threatened or attacked. Also, if you look at the danger to the non-Muslims in the West, we are aware of the Charlie Hebdo situation, the situation of the Danish cartoons, the Swedish cartoons, and others, but they can become fairly widespread. Now, my mind's gone blank. Who can remember? There was a cartoonist, we'll go back to the Reverend in a minute, a cartoonist for the Seattle Weekly. And my mind has blanked, sorry, on her last name. First name, Molly, can you remember? Ivans. It'll come. Okay. Somehow this has gone down the memory hole in the United States. When there was controversy about Muhammad cartoons, he said, let's get all the cartoonists together and have a Let's Draw Muhammad Day. She got threats, withdrew, apologized. FBI advised her that she should go into the equivalent of a witness protection program. So she resigned her position, has changed her name, given up being a journalist, a cartoonist, and has gone into hiding.
Molly Norris.
Molly Norris, thank you. Good. That was a test I wanted to see. Okay, Molly Norris. You remember that there have been plots against the lives of the producers of South Park on the Comedy Channel. So those are going on. This particular one, you might remember, of a threat to burning a Quran, or rather a threat to burn a Quran. And this sort of drew in everybody. We all remember our Florida pastor. But in this case, this is from Al-Qaeda's online magazine, Inspire. And a few of the people we have over here, Salman Rushdie, Fleming Rose, the editor of Yale and Poston, Lars Vilks, attempt on his life last Saturday. Others, Geert Wilders, the Dutch politician, Kurt Westergaard, another Swedish cartoon, Pastor Terry Jones, who you see over there, and Carlton Just, who is another, actually the editor of Yale and Poston. So there are death threats against those people on the internet. Again, we could mention many others. But I hope you're now beginning to get a sense of how widespread is the phenomenon we're talking about. These are not occasional assaults on cartoonists. Of course, the widest pattern is self-censorship. For each person who's imprisoned or threatened or beaten up or killed, there are hundreds or perhaps thousands who decide we're not going to go there. Usually they say, well, I'm too sensitive to do those things. But I'm not sure I believe that. Just a couple of sort of minor ones. January 9th, 2014, in an article in the New York Times, on a statue of Muhammad that until 1955 graced the rooftop of the Appellate Division Courthouse at Madison Avenue and 25th Street, New York, refused to show a photograph of the statue. This is a statue on a public building in New York. This was not an insulting statue. I mean, Charlie Hebdo is a pretty gross scatological magazine. But these were sort of respectful statues. But we're not putting those up. Another example. Sorry, this is stretched a bit to get it in, but that's the Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C. And there is a frieze which you see showing various lawgivers. One of them is Muhammad. He's holding a book and a scimitar. He stands between Charlemagne and Justinian, and just along the way from Hugo Grotius, William Blackstone, and John Marshall there. So that's currently on the Supreme Court building. With present trends, I think many of our newspapers would refuse to publish a picture of the US Supreme Court building which contained this. At least that's happened with another building here. So the pattern is getting wider and wider. It's not just insult and sensitivity. In sort of closing these up, and then let's open it up to discussion, let me go back to the point I made earlier, is the major danger of this is the suppression of debate, dissent, and renewal within Islam. As mentioned before, I'm a visiting professor at Sharif Hidayatullah Islamic State University, which is the largest Islamic State university in Indonesia. And I'm in the graduate school. The dean of that graduate school gets death threats for what he writes. He's a very careful, believing Muslim scholar. But he disagrees with a lot of radicals, and so this is what happens to Ajumadi. But here's a few others. This is, again, a Muslim, Salman Taseer, the governor of Punjab. He was opposing Pakistan's blasphemy law and was demanding the release of Asia Bibi, a Christian woman still imprisoned for blasphemy and sentenced to death. He said the blasphemy laws in Pakistan are horrible. So he was accused of blasphemy for criticizing the blasphemy law. And so he was killed. We had his daughter speaking at Hudson a year or two back. And again, I want to embrace this particular point. The word liberal here can be understood very broadly. This isn't insulting. He said, in the Pakistan context, this is a warning to every liberal. Shut up or be shot. This went further, by the way. Unusually, the man who killed Taseer was tried. Usually they're not. And was sentenced to death, for which the judge was accused, not by the court, not by the state, by the people, of blasphemy. Why? Because you condemned to death a man who, because he criticized the blasphemy law, must have been a blasphemer. And then you get the question, can you defend the judge? Or would that be blasphemous? And we're starting to get here very like a Monty Python element. Or if you defended a person who defended the judge who sentenced to death a man regarded as a blasphemer because he opposed the blasphemy law. And there are other chains like this. So anyway, Taseer was killed. In conclusion, I'm going to quote another couple of authors in respect to this. The late Hafez Abu Zaid actually has a chapter in that book, Silence, we mentioned. He was charged with apostasy in Egypt because of his writings on the Quran. Says that the charges of blasphemy, insulting Islam, are key weapons in the fundamentalists' arsenal, strategically employed to prevent reform of Muslim societies, and instead confine the world's Muslim population to a bleak, colorless prison of socio-cultural and political conformity. One other, the late Abdullah Ram Wahid, former president of Indonesia, which is the world's largest Muslim country, and former president of Nahdlatul Ulama, which is the world's largest Muslim organization, some 40 or 50 million people. If I may put in and you ignore the guy in the very loud shirt there. Wahid actually wrote the foreword to the book Silenced, which will come out in Indonesia next month. He died recently, amazing man. And his foreword to the book Silence is now quite famous in its own right. It's called God Needs No Defense. It's actually a rap song in Indonesia with that title. But this is what, lost it. Anyway, Wahid was a strong defender of free speech and said, rather than give in to the fundamentalist demands, fundamentalism was his statement. He said, which will condemn us all. He said, Western societies should strongly uphold positions of free speech and freedom of religion and seek to get Muslim countries to do likewise. My basic theme is this, that when we look at questions of blasphemy or insulting Islam, not to get too fixated on the more sort of spectacular Western cases, but to realize we're dealing with a global phenomenon, very widespread, whose victims are not, most of whose victims are not Westerners, and most of whom, in any normal sense of the word, are not blasphemous and insulting, but merely disagreeing and arguing. So my conclusion is this. When politics and religion are intertwined, as they necessarily are in debates about blasphemy, then unless we can have religious debate, we cannot have political debate. Unless we have religious disagreement, we cannot have political disagreement. And unless we have religious freedom, we cannot have political freedom. Thank you very much.